Some of the more obscure and enigmatic creatures in the lands between are perhaps the ones relating to insects or sea life, most notably the cemetery shade and the kindreds of rot. While kindreds of rot are more prevalent, cemetery shades can only be found in a handful of locations within all of the lands between. The kindreds of rot, however, are often found in regions with a connection to the scarlet rot, the same disease that afflicts Melania, the daughter America. They are described as pale pests who crawl through the lands afflicted by scarlet rot, the abandoned children of the goddess. Rot for the scarlet goddess, O scarlet blossoms, flourish in distant lands, and return to us, the unwanted children. The kindreds of rot may also look a lot like shrimps or crustaceans even, yet they are also called pests, and this is interesting, as pest typically refers to an insect that attacks crops and livestock. While their appearance is arguably close to that of a shrimp, the fact that they are called pests may imply an insect connection, and many refer to them as having an appearance that is like that of a centipede rather than some form of sea life. Moreover, as was pointed out by Mad Luigi, the kindreds of rot also look somewhat like praying mantises, which only further strengthens this insect connection. And while I will return to this later, perhaps it's possible that the kindreds of rot are in fact parasites latched onto humanoid beings, and it's through this parasitic relationship that the kindreds of rot are able to serve their goddess of rot. The cemetery shades can only be found in the Tombs Ward catacombs, Black Knife catacombs, Caelid catacombs, and St. Gelmir Hero's grave. And they also seem to be involved in some sort of parasitic relationship with their host, with a creature that bears a striking resemblance to a spider crab, controlling the shade from atop their head. It's often difficult to see, and many including myself assume that the black strands atop the head of the shade was simply the hair of the creature, yet this is not the case. As many other channels have explored, there is clearly some sort of spider crab creature that is resting atop the head of the shade and almost certainly controls the movement of the shade, as the same white glow is emitted from the crab creature as well as the eyes of the shade, implying the white glow of the crab is in total control of the cemetery shade's body, whoever they once were. It's currently believed that these cemetery shades were once the grave wardens of the catacombs, and that they are now infested with insects and creatures that continue to puppet the body long after it has expired. In fact, the description of the mantis blades, the weapons of the cemetery shades, reads as follows: a curved sword with a blade at both ends wielded by the cemetery shades, the insect-ridden gravekeepers. The blade is thin and sharp, and strong attack unleashes a far-reaching slash. The most interesting aspect of this description to me is the admission that the cemetery shades are insect-ridden. Of course, this would make sense considering the cemetery shades reside below ground where many insects make their home. However, this somewhat implies that the creature atop the head of the cemetery shade is in fact an insect. The horn-like protrusions on the head of the spider-like creature resemble the appendages of several insects, and this may further imply this creature is some sort of insect itself. Moreover, the fact that the cemetery shades use a weapon called the mantis blade only solidifies this connection further. Beyond this, it's been noted that the mantis blade and pest's glaive, the weapons of the kindreds of rot, are quite similar, and this may hint at a potential connection between these seemingly distinct species. As mentioned previously, some have pointed out that the kindreds of rot have an appearance that can also be likened to that of a praying mantis, which seems to further this insect connection between certain inhabitants of the lands between. What has happened to the insects of Elden Ring? Have they evolved? Have they become parasitic? Is it both? Could forces in the lands between be acting similar to that of radiation mutation in the real world? I ask these questions because it has been pointed out that the kindreds of rot appear as though they could be enlarged insects or sea life from their interaction with the scarlet rot and its goddess. We also know that the creature on the cemetery shade is wholly in control of the actions of the body, and thus, it makes one wonder what has led to this slow insect takeover of the lands between. Moreover, we still don't know much about either of these enemies. We certainly have more information available on the kindreds of rot, though it's admittedly still not a lot to work with. We know they are connected to the scarlet rot, considered pests, use a web-based projectile attack, look like some sort of crustacean or insect, and wield a weapon called the pest's glaive. The glaive's description reads as follows: glaive made from a hard, sharpened shell, wielded by the pests who emerged from the swamp of Aeonia, slightly increases non-physical damage negation. Though men might recognize the keen intellect of the pests evidenced by this spear's uncanny design, it will never be understood by them. Interestingly, the description claims that the kindreds of rot emerged from the swamp of Aeonia, suggesting that this is their origin point, whether it be that they grew from the scarlet rot, or perhaps were somehow mutated and evolved through their proximity to it. The glaive is also said to be from a hardened shell of some sort, and that its design will never be understood by men. Perhaps this refers to the insect or crustacean origin of the Kindreds of Rot, as it's likely something only other pests could ever understand. At this point, I would like to point out that it's commonly accepted that crustaceans are not insects, but the science community has realized that insects are probably crustaceans. Both insects and crustaceans are arthropods characterized by segmented bodies, exoskeletons, and legs with joints. Genomic studies have also revealed that the two groups have a common ancestor. With that in mind, is it possible that this crustacean/insect dichotomy of Elden Ring is less of a dichotomy than I had imagined? If insects are crustaceans, then it lends credence to the idea that there is something about sea life, and perhaps crustaceans in particular, that is rotten in the lands between. Perhaps this fact is something that the developers of Elden Ring had taken into account already, as the creature on the head of the cemetery shade appears to be an amalgamation of several creatures, likely some sort of spider, crab, and moth. The Kindreds of Rot are similar, with their appearance evoking imagery of both praying mantises, centipedes, and various forms of crustaceans and sea life. Considering I have seen several others discuss the praying mantis connection, I want to point out that the mantis blades mentioned earlier could serve as a reference to the spiritual significance that some cultures have placed on praying mantises. The people of ancient Greece and Egypt saw the praying mantis as a guide for those who needed direction, either in life or death. In Buddhism, the praying mantis represents patience and perseverance. This connects succinctly, as the cemetery shades were once the watchers of the catacombs, the grave wardens, yet they had been corrupted by some outside force. The cemetery shades carrying mantis blades would fit thematically with past religions, as the wardens would have acted as protectors to help guide the dead toward the afterlife and protect their remains. They also have incredible patience and perseverance as they have continued to protect the catacombs they were tasked with watching over, despite their very being wasting away due to the parasitic crab's influence. The only other crabs in the lands between are the mud crabs of varying sizes that can be found primarily in swamps and are an interesting case as they exhibit signs of being afflicted by the death blight when observing their shells, as they appear to be slowly taking on the malformed visage of Godwin's corpse. It's an interesting connection as Godwin's body looks quite fishy itself, considering the tail and the webbed hands. It appears as though the crab life in the lands between is particularly vulnerable to deathroot, a small link to Godwin's semi-aquatic appearance. Another connection that has been pointed out between deathroot and crabs is the fact that one of the cemetery shades will drop the ashes of Lutel the Headless, which doesn't appear to be significant at first, until you realize that Lutel the Headless was one of the headless golden vanishing guards of Godwin in the Erdtree depths, painting a clear connection between the crab-like creature controlling the cemetery shade and Godwin and his deathroot. Could it be that the crab controlling the cemetery shade is a mutated creature, or an amalgamation of animals that were influenced by the pervasive presence of deathroot in the catacombs? That seems to be the prevailing theory, as this is effectively the only other crab creature in the lands between, and both types of crab are influenced by deathroot, as is clearly seen in the shells of mud crabs, which resemble barnacle infestations that crabs in the real world can experience. However, as others have discussed, the cemetery shade and the crab creature controlling it have virtually no information to elicit their origins. However, as I just mentioned, we know that the cemetery shade and the crab are likely connected to deathroot in some way, especially when considering the prevalence of Godwin's deathroot spreading through the catacombs of the lands between and giving rise to those who live in death. Where the Kindreds of Rot share a connection to the Scarlet Rot, the cemetery shades share a connection with Godwin's deathroot that has overtaken the catacombs of the lands between. We have also seen deathroot have a connection to other aquatic life, most notably the appearance of Godwin's soulless body that has seemingly started to take on the appearance of some distorted fish and amphibious creatures such as the basilisks lurking near the body. In two of the catacombs in which the shades can be found, we can actually find deathroot in chests, which serves to strengthen this connection. Deathroot gives rise to those who live in death, and the catacombs are the perfect place for deathroot to take hold of unsuspecting grave wardens. Moreover, they are weak to holy damage, and similar to the tibia mariners, they can do short-distance phase or teleports, and the aquatic theme of the mariner may also relate to the shade, as there appears to be a connection between aquatic life and enemies and death or deathroot. The basilisks, for example, can curse the player with deathblight, which can kill the tarnished instantly once the meter is full, and are most notably found in the deep-root depths near Godwin's corpse, hinting at their link to deathroot. The basilisks also share the eyes of Godwin, demonstrating that the deathroot can have a major influence on the life around it. Interestingly, the basilisks can be found in many locations throughout the lands between, and not all are necessarily related to deathroot, such as the Lake of Rot, where these creatures can be also found. Is it possible that all of these creatures originated in some way from the Lake of Rot and through various means evolved to be quite different, an example of divergent evolution perhaps? Divergent evolution typically occurs when two groups of a species are separated by some sort of environmental barrier, and perhaps this applies to many of the insects and aquatic creatures of Elden Ring. And those that remained near the Lake of Rot became Kindreds of Rot, whereas the others spread out and became Basilisks and cemetery shade crabs. When it comes to crabs, there is actually a well-known phenomenon in which many species eventually evolved to be crab-like, and while it's been memed on heavily, the crab-like appearance is actually the opposite of the example I just mentioned. Many of the animals that look just like crabs but aren't exemplify the concept of convergent evolution. Divergent evolution refers to a species evolving differently when separated over time, whereas convergent evolution refers to when a separate species evolved to develop similar features, such as bats and birds, both having wings despite not belonging to the same class of animal, or the fact that there are cactus-like plants all over the globe that are all unrelated. So, while it's possible that the crabs, basilisks, and kindreds of rot could share a common ancestor, it's difficult to say with certainty. And on top of that, it's possible to say that these are all creatures that evolved and adapted independently of one another. However, the presence of the basilisks in several locations not related to Deathroot or Godwyn does seem to imply that they may share a common ancestor with the Kindreds of Rot and the crabs, as we know that the Kindreds of Rot emerged from the Lake of Rot, and perhaps some of the life forms that arose from that rotten lake may have been affected by Deathroot, altering their composition over hundreds of years since the death of Godwyn and the pervasive spread of Deathroot. While there is no doubt that the crabs of Elden Ring are connected to Deathroot, as are the basilisks, which resemble frogs, we also know the Kindreds of Rot are intrinsically connected to the Scarlet Rot and its goddess. Unlike the basilisks, the Kindreds of Rot primarily appear in the locations that have some sort of physical connections to the Scarlet Rot, as many can be found wandering the wilds of Caelid, where the Scarlet Rot has made a home for itself. As had been identified by other channels, the Kindreds of Rot appear as though they can actually be a large arthropod attached to the back and head of a humanoid, which could perhaps connect it back to the crab atop the head of the cemetery shade, as these are effectively the only two creatures to have this kind of parasitic relationship with the host within the game. Of course, we don't know for certain that the Kindreds of Rot operate this way. However, it would fit with the notion of these creatures sharing a common ancestor, as some could have evolved to be more crab-like, whereas others evolved to be more like centipedes. Though the same could be said for the inverse, and that these could be animals that evolved to have similar parasitic traits despite not being closely related at all. Though the cemetery shade crabs and Kindreds of Rot do admittedly share a similar web-based attack, which could again lend credence to the notion that these insect/crustacean creatures could share a common ancestor and may have simply evolved differently due to environmental circumstances. The crabs evolved underground closer to the influence of Deathroot, while the Kindreds of Rot evolved in the Lake of Rot, influenced by the Scarlet Rot and its goddess. As far as I'm aware, these are the only two creatures in the lands between with a web-based attack, albeit they are a little bit different. Regardless, this is one of the stronger lines of evidence that the crabs and Kindreds of Rot may have shared an ancestor before the intervention of the Goddess of Rot and Godwyn's Deathroot afflicting the land. This likely ties back to the giant mud crabs we see throughout the lands between having deathblight on their shells, as it could very well be from the crabs often spending much of their time in the earth, similar to that of the cemetery shade crab that has been afflicted by Deathroot within the catacombs. The Kindreds of Rot share a connection more with liquid, whereas crabs are linked to the ground. And then there are the basilisks, which fit quite perfectly in the middle. Basilisks are clearly modeled after frogs, which are amphibious creatures, meaning they live in both water and on land. I find this to be a very pertinent detail, as the basilisks are often found in both areas with and without water. Most notably, as I've mentioned, they can be found in the deep-root depths as well as the Lake of Rot, which may very well suggest the basilisks are actually a version of the same animal that evolved in response to both Deathroot and the Scarlet Rot, considering they are both present in locations with connections to both. And this would line up well with the idea that the crabs, including the cemetery shade crabs, evolved due to their connection to the earth, and the Kindreds of Rot evolved due to their connection with the Lake of Rot, and the basilisks evolved in response to both, producing a noticeably amphibious creature. While this is mostly wild speculation based on what I've seen from other channels, I found it to be an interesting topic that could warrant further discussion. I really like the idea that many of these creatures could share a common ancestor and have evolved drastically differently due to different outer gods and environmental factors taking place. I also like to think this could all tie back somehow to the One Great, as the crabs, basilisks, and Kindreds of Rot may have once been the same creature, yet the continuing proliferation of unique life led to changes, fractures in the One Great, if you will. I also find it fascinating how the cemetery shade connects back to Lutel the Headless, and by proxy, Godwyn's soulless corpse. This is easily the clearest connection between Godwyn and these crabs, and the connection only becomes stronger when acknowledging that the mud crabs are clearly afflicted by the Deathblight, so it stands to reason another crab variant has also been afflicted by the Deathroot. especially when we know that the environment can play a major role in adaptation in real life as well as in the lands between. It would be helpful if we knew more about the goddess of rot, as I don't feel as though it's safe to say she is directly connected to death, and that seems to be more so the realm of the outer god of the twin birds. Though it's interesting to see how fromsoftware has demonstrated that not all life is compatible, as the lake of rot and the scarlet rot itself is mostly viewed as a deadly disease, one that has slowly consumed millennia, arguably the strongest child, America, though I'm sure Radon would contest such a claim. However, despite the generally negative view and effects that the rot has on most life forms, it's clear that there are worshippers of the rot and its goddess, and life can either spring from the rot, or it can mutate life forms, as we still don't know if the kindreds of rot were truly born from the rot, or if they were simply evolved and enlarged by living in and near the rot. In the real world, there are many animals and insects that thrive off the rot of other beings, such as scavengers that consume rotten meat regularly or insects that love decay, and perhaps this is FromSoft's take on such a phenomenon. I really hope we will learn more about these creatures with the release of the DLC, though it really would not be surprising if we never receive any concrete answers, as is the norm from FromSoftware games at this point. Though that's the way it should be, as we would instantly lose all the mystery and intrigue if all the details about every creature and location were available, as this is what many games already do, and most don't have the lasting power of the recent FromSoft games. Moreover, it would detract from the environmental storytelling in these games, as so much time and effort goes into crafting the intricately detailed worlds of them, and it would no longer be as necessary for people to go sleuthing through them, and they would lose a lot of the enjoyment that the community has cultivated surrounding the investigative approach so many take toward Elden Ring. And it's kind of their thing to craft supremely interesting, supremely vague stories that require video game detectives to decipher it all. If you found any of this interesting, learned anything new, or have anything interesting to add to the discussion, feel free to drop a comment down below. I always read every comment, and I love responding and interacting with all of you. If you want to see more Elden Ring and nerdy content like this, then go ahead and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you soon. Peace out.